On a sweltering night, stalking through the dense jungles of Vietnam, a tiger crawled its way close to the floor. It moved silently despite its immense size and power, hungry and looking for its next meal. Weighing nearly 300 pounds, this Bengal tiger navigated itself through the brush, vines, and swamps with ease. It was a young tiger, the adults easily weighing as much as 400 pounds, and reaching lengths of 8 to 9 feet long. Yet it was no less a fierce predator, in its element, its senses totally in tune with its surroundings, mind sharp and focused, eyes adapted to the darkness of the jungles in which it roamed. Its black, white, and orange stripes helped it blend into the jungles, camouflaging its movements, making it near impossible to spot until too late. Before its prey could run, the tiger had already taken it. This particular night, the tiger spotted something different. Crouched just ahead was a strange creature, kneeling, bipedal, something strange and boxish strapped to the creature's back. The tiger had likely seen many monkeys and apes similar to this creature before, but none quite like this, and from here, the tiger had decided what its next meal might be. It crouched, ready to strike and pounce, to attack and strike and kill in the hopes of satiating its hunger. The prey seemed totally unaware of the tiger's presence. Good. This would be an easy hunt, and the tiger just stayed there, eyes wide open, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to launch itself forward. Then it happened. Its prey turned its back to the tiger, and said tiger sprang itself from its hiding spot and attacked. I first heard this story from Mark Felton's short video on the topic, and I decided that I really wanted to dig a little further into it. And unfortunately, much to my dismay, Felton, he didn't list the sources for his video within the description or anything. And this didn't mean like I didn't believe in the story at all, because he is an accredited historian, he's a well-researched historian, he's someone that you can trust the information which he's given. But I wanted to learn more, and often if you put sources in like your descriptions of your videos or in a bibliography, if it's a blog post or something, that's where I can find more information and start digging through it and learn more. Now, finding any sources documenting the incident in which we're about to discuss proved quite difficult. As a result, I sort of discovered some gaps within the story itself. In full disclosure, some of what we are about to discuss is conjecture. I've had no choice but to kind of piece together a rather broken puzzle with a few missing pieces. I've thus done my best to try to cobble events together, the people, the story, everything itself into something cohesive and something more comprehensible, while also understanding that these were and are real people that we're talking about, and I wished to respect them and their families as much as I possibly could. So with all this in mind, let us proceed. April 1970. During the height of the Vietnam War, Sergeant Robert C. Phleger had just touched back down after spending some R&R in Hawaii with his wife. The man had joined 1st Force Recon as a radio specialist, where he excelled not just as an operator and technician, but eventually as a leader. He met with Corporal Jerry Smith, a man he'd taken a keen interest in. Phleger had developed a great reputation for developing his team, making them grow and honing in their skills to best suit survival in an unforgiving war. Together, they went to HQ and received their new assignment. Their task force had been stationed along the A Shau Valley, a place with a terrain most wouldn't picture in Vietnam. While most know the jungles, the vast majority of people picture rice fields, swamps, and winding rivers. The A Shau Valley contains some of the steepest mountains in the region, of course surrounded by thick, dense jungles. There was also a sparse human population here, making it perfect for NVA and Viet Cong fighters to hide and plot. Phleger received this new assignment, which consisted of a 5-day recon mission somewhere in the A Shau Valley. This mission was to be easy and simple, the perfect teaching opportunity for Corporal Smith to take command of the team. Phleger also hadn't much time left in the force, his tour of duty nearly complete. His lieutenant had thus requested Phleger not to go, to remain behind and await for his team to return. Sergeant Phleger never liked being outside his team when sent on a mission. It just never sat right with him. He knew these men, joked with them, learned who they were and what made them tick. Thus he refused to send his 7-man team places he couldn't go himself, which is what set him apart as an outstanding leader and, in many ways, a father figure. No, Phleger wouldn't stay behind. Much to the lieutenant's consternation, he agreed to allow Phleger to join his men on one condition. This would be the sergeant's last mission on the front lines. Phleger agreed. Once properly debriefed, Phleger informed Corporal Smith and the others of their task, and they geared up and they prepared for 5 grueling days deep in the jungles and far away from civilization and their comrades. Afternoon, May 5th, 1970. Their helicopter dropped them off around the base of Razorback Ridge, where Sergeant Phleger and Corporal Smith were greeted by the lush, thick, and dangerous Vietnamese jungles. Once properly disembarked, the team was left alone, their only source of transportation back to American lines now soaring away. Then Sergeant Phleger took the lead, looked up at the 65-degree slopes that made up their destination, felt the heat, the sweat, could hear the countless numbers of insects flying around in the hopes of finding some exposed flesh. They spent a majority of the afternoon climbing the ridge until the sun had almost completely set. Phleger brought Smith forward, both of them observing the ridgeline, where they quickly deduced they couldn't deploy in their usual 360-degree defensive pattern. This left them in a dangerous position should enemy VC appear, but what other choice did they have? Phleger ordered his team stretched atop the ridgeline in a narrow line, placing himself at the furthest edge. If anyone was going to put themselves in the most danger on this mission, it would be him. Night soon settled over Razorback Ridge, and visibility had fallen next to zero, to thick trees blocking most of the moonlight. The Marines had settled down, hunkering low, their eyes and ears open, listening, observing anything out of the ordinary. One of these men was Corporal Smith, the man listening to the natural ambience of the jungle. He breathed, stayed calm, alert, sat a good distance between Sergeant Phleger and his next comrade. Like the others, he dressed down, placing his ammo belt on the ground along with his M16. He also removed his poncho, laying it flat to serve as a makeshift bed. This mainly protected him from the countless numbers of creepy crawlies that permeated the ground both above and below its surface. Then he heard something, the rustling of foliage, an unidentified force moving its way through the brush. But he couldn't see anything, readied his gun on instinct, listened some more, eyes scanning, watching, never quite adjusting to the sheer darkness. He also couldn't call out in fear of giving away their position. According to B.H. Norton, the following happened. Quote, "There was a sudden rushing movement in the dense brush, accompanied by several short muffled screams from Sergeant Phleger. Then there was nothing. No sounds, no breathing. Only the natural ambience of the jungle. Others in the team had heard the brief commotion as well, some moving closer to Corporal Smith. They radioed back to their lieutenant, stating that something might have happened to their sergeant, but nothing else followed. There's been no further disturbances, nor moves against the rest of the team." The lieutenant tried to stay positive, thinking that perhaps Sergeant Phleger had a nightmare and possibly wandered off briefly into the jungles. But that didn't seem like Phleger at all, and had Phleger come back, or moved ahead too far, surely the rest of the team would have heard it. In fact, Phleger had only positioned himself roughly 5 feet in front of the nearest Marine. So what happened? Had the VC moved in for an ambush? The NVA? Corporal Smith and the others wanted to call out to Phleger to see if their sergeant would answer, but that might compromise the rest of the team should the VC or NVA actually move in. Should they shine a light to where Phleger had positioned himself? No, they couldn't. This, too, might compromise the team. Seeing no other option, Corporal Smith and a couple other teammates decided to crawl through the brush, moving slowly, trying not to make too much noise. They found clear signs as to where their sergeant had sat, but nothing more, and the darkness made it near impossible to ascertain what had occurred here. Now frustrated and terrified, they crawled back to the others, reported what little they saw. If any of the team had begun dozing off, they were now fully awake. No, Sergeant Phleger hadn't had a nightmare and grown disorientated. That was now clear. Something bad had happened to him, but by who or what, the team couldn't ascertain. They stayed like this until sunrise, watching, looking, listening, some hoping they'd hear Sergeant Phleger returning. But he never did. Come sunrise, the team had gotten to their feet after a tense night and trudged over to Sergeant Phleger's last known position. The first thing they noticed was the sergeant's rifle, a detail they'd missed in the pitch black of night. Phleger's ammo belt had also been laid out neatly, suggesting he'd taken it off once he'd sat down, but they couldn't find his poncho. Not yet, anyway. They moved along, fanning out, guns to their shoulders, searching for more evidence to Phleger's ultimate fate. Eventually, one Marine discovered the sergeant's hat and poncho liner. It had been discarded a good distance from Phleger's original position, and to make matters worse, they soon found both items were covered in blood. Phleger's blood. That's when someone discovered the drag marks, the small blood trail, both leading deep into the thickest parts of the jungle. Having seen this, Corporal Smith then radioed back to their lieutenant, who ordered them to follow the trail, it hopefully leading to both Phleger and whatever had dragged him away. Most expected to find Phleger dead, the sorrow filling the pits of their stomachs. But they'd seen dead soldiers and enemies before. If Phleger had been ambushed by the enemy, they were prepared and ready to radio it as such. It was the logical reality of a soldier's life during war to report the death of a friend while on duty. They also dreaded they'd need to report their sergeant as missing in action. But they never for one moment suspected they'd find the sergeant's body like this. They stopped, looked on in horror at the body heap stretched out before them. It was, indeed, Sergeant Phleger, but only half of him. The entire upper half, split at the torso, had been partially devoured. The shock was instantaneous, and Corporal Smith hurriedly went for his radio to give his report, but he was silenced by the most unnerving roar they'd ever heard. Less than 3 yards away launched a tiger, the animal charging straight at them. No one needed to think on it, M16s lighting up, firing towards the tiger, who was largely obscured by the jungle foliage. But the loudness of the guns must have scared the beast off, the tiger turning 180 degrees around and darting off, disappearing into the deep brush. Had they wounded the tiger at all? No one knew, though some said they'd failed to land a hit, the creature too quick, the jungle concealing it too well. It didn't really matter to Corporal Smith, however, and he had the men begin gathering Sergeant Phleger's remains before radioing back to the lieutenant. He asked for an immediate evacuation. They'd want to move quickly, too, not liking the idea of a possibly wounded tiger now stalking them in an already hostile environment. That's when they heard it again, the rustling, the sound of a quadruped charging at them. Out came the tiger once more, its face bloody, having partially devoured Sergeant Phleger. It quickly leapt into a position, placing itself between its prey and the Marines, hissing, swiping, roaring at them, then darting off when the firing began. Some of the team sprayed and prayed, while others shot their M16s in controlled bursts. One even lobbed a fragment grenade, which scared the tiger deep into the jungles. Wasting no time, the team gathered Sergeant Phleger's remains into his poncho and began their steep descent down Razorback Ridge. And once at the bottom, a helicopter arrived, picking the team up and prematurely ending their mission. Upon returning to base, a medical team immediately did an autopsy on Phleger's remains. They determined the tiger had pounced on him from behind and bit into his neck, which explained the muffled screams Corporal Smith had reported. Having seized Phleger properly, the tiger then broke his neck. This mercifully killed Phleger before the tiger could begin eating him. Phleger's team had successfully left the jungles, but the tiger that killed their sergeant, and others like it, still prowled the area around Razorback Ridge, waiting, stalking, looking for their next meal. A second team. A second team needed to be dispatched for patrol around the same area that Phleger's team had been stationed, this one being led by a man named Sergeant Michael Larkins. His team was dispatched by a large CH-46 helicopter to carry their larger numbers. Once they touched down, the rear ramp lowered, and Larkins led the way deep into areas where it was likely no man had ever stepped foot. Sergeant Larkins' patrol was a success, and the same helicopter that had brought them now arrived to extract them. It touched down, lowered the rear ramp, and the task force began to climb inside. Sergeant Larkins stayed behind, looking back, urging his men aboard the extraction helicopter. But before he boarded, he noticed some of his men pointing out, looked that way, could see what had caught his men's eyes. He raised his weapon, saw something charge out of the brush and straight at him. A rush of white, black, and orange. Larkins didn't think twice, pointed his M16 in that direction, and shot a single round. Wounded, the tiger tried to retreat, turned broadside momentarily, staying there just long enough for Sergeant Larkins to unload his magazine directly into it. The tiger fell in a lifeless heap, a mere 15 feet away from Larkins and the helicopter. But why did it attack? Hunger could easily explain why the tiger had gone after Sergeant Phleger. It was in the middle of the night. Phleger was basically alone and isolated. It made perfect sense why a tiger would choose Sergeant Phleger as a target, if you know the instincts and how tigers hunt. But with Sergeant Larkins' team, something just doesn't quite make sense, because these men were in the middle of extraction, right? Meaning the helicopter was right there and running. It's so loud that Larkins' men actually needed to use hand signals to communicate with him. Plus, all the wind that the CH-46 would turn up, it's the opposite of an ideal place for a tiger to launch an ambush. This leads to some overall confusion as to what transpired next. Seeing as the tiger had been shot in roughly the same vicinity as the incident with Sergeant Phleger, many assumed that Larkins' tiger was the killer. In fact, Larkins had his men drag the dead tiger aboard the extraction helicopter, and there is documented proof of this kill, including photographs. This tiger also fit the brief description Corporal Smith provided. The tiger was relatively small for a Bengal tiger, weighing around 300 pounds. It was also determined the tiger was female, which lends credence to its small stature. But upon closer inspection, this tiger had no previous wounds on it besides where Sergeant Larkins had shot it. With all the supposed firepower seen by Corporal Smith and his team, you'd think they'd land a small wound. Not even a pierce of fragment grenade had been found. Then someone did an apparent autopsy, in which most of the information here is quite sketchy. It was indeed determined that Sergeant Larkins' tiger was not the one that killed Sergeant Phleger, meaning that tiger still roamed the jungles around Razorback Ridge. So was the tiger that Sergeant Larkins that was attacking them, was that the same one which killed Sergeant Phleger? That seems to be the predominant question that kind of comes up in circles, be it on Reddit or anywhere, discussing this very incident. In fact, some sources I found don't even have any confirmation of if Sergeant Larkins' tiger was the one that killed Phleger or not. They just don't know. And so the information given to us that an autopsy was given, from what I've found, is a little sketchy. In fact, with so little information about this incident, it's actually hard to determine what happened at all. But while some believe that Sergeant Larkins' tiger attacked out of hunger, I can't help but be skeptical here. From my limited experience with animals in the woods of North America, which again is vastly different than Vietnam, the scene itself seems too crazy for this tiger to have attacked simply out of hunger. No, this seems to fit an animal backed into a corner, scared. Perhaps it felt threatened by these men moving through its territory, and now a gargantuan helicopter had all but landed upon it. So no, this attack to me didn't seem to fit the description of it being hungry, but instead, out of defense, it lashed out. I side with the sources that claim Sergeant Larkins' tiger was not the same one which killed Sergeant Phleger, which in some ways makes this story all the more terrifying, that there isn't just one man-eating tiger out there, but many. Such a story brings into perspective just how dangerous the battlefields were. These Marines, and our armed forces in general, had to contend with countless numbers of adversaries that weren't just the human enemy. Bugs, snakes, spiders, diseases, and certainly tigers. Upon several days of research, I've only found one notable source mentioning the story of Sergeant Phleger's team and their encounter with the Bengal tiger. That comes from B.H. Norton's Force Recon Diary, 1970. It being the only source, really, available, I debated on even producing this documentary. I debated if the story had even happened. Is this just another war legend, exacerbated by people telling the tale time and time and time again, each time being a little bigger and more embellished than the last? Then I came across the Wall of Faces, and I found Sergeant Phleger's memorial. Then I found the Together We Served website for the U.S. Marines. The cause of death was listed as, quote, non-hostile, died of other causes. And this really brought things into perspective for me. I no longer questioned the validity of the story and felt ashamed I would have questioned its validity at all. And at this moment, I said, yes, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make this documentary. The events I just described, even if I did need to do some inferencing, did happen. It did occur. Sergeant Phleger was killed by a tiger. It is a case of man versus nature. It helped bring into light the horrors of those jungles in Vietnam and what those men had to endure. And in some ways, I hope this small documentary kind of helps us remember who these men were so that they aren't forgotten and what they experienced isn't forgotten. If you liked this video, help the channel grow. Hit subscribe and see more documentaries like this, along with other content. All our social media is also in the description below. Thank you for watching.